Livestream. This is where Louisiana Clean Fuels, obviously, and I'm Tyler Herrmann, co-coordinator. And today we're going to do a little bit of a discussion about natural gas and just kind of go over some of the basics. And this will be the first part in a little series we're going to do about the different fuel types, different alternative fuels that we deal with, kind of just explaining what they are and just kind of getting that little baseline understanding of what the fuels actually are and what it means to use a natural gas vehicle. So we've got a list of just kind of basic questions, and please just feel free to submit any questions if you have anything as it comes up, and we'll do our best to answer them. So who's the first question?
All right, so the first question.
It's the obvious one.
Be ready for the real hardball here. What is natural gas?
Oh, I don't think I have to answer that. No, so natural gas. Natural gas is a fuel that we're all actually more used to than maybe you realize. It's what powers a lot of our houses. We have a flame stovetop, that's natural gas. Huge pipeline network across the entire country. We use it for electricity generation and everything. And the primary heating component in it that's combustible is methane. As a vehicle fuel, the minimum threshold for methane in it is 95%, and then 5% usually CO2 or nitrogen or something like that. It's just primarily methane that we can burn and get stuff out of. And then, of course, the obvious follow-up to that is, what is methane?
That is the next question, indeed.
Yeah, I can see them. I'm cheating. Methane is a short hydrocarbon, meaning that it's got hydrogen and carbon atoms in it. It's 1 carbon, 4 hydrogens, CH4. This is the chemical for it. And that's a much shorter chain hydrocarbon than what we might use for like diesel or gasoline, which can have 10s and 20s of carbon atoms with hydrogen atoms attached to it. So very short chain hydrocarbon. Burns nice and clean, and if you combust it correctly, you should only get H2O and CO2 out of it, and there are no real impurities with it because it's such a small molecule. I guess it's also worth mentioning where methane comes from too, and where we get it while I'm talking about that. Methane kind of has 3 major sources that we can think about. We have the methane that comes from just the oil wells that you drill in for your normal petroleum drilling, and when you tap into those wells, you actually have different layers of hydrocarbons that you get out. The first thing that comes out are the very light hydrocarbons because they're very volatile and very low density, so they come out really quickly, and that's primarily methane at first, and then you can get butanes, ethanes, propanes, and all those sorts of things. The short chain hydrocarbons, much lighter, much quicker to come out of the oil wells. And then you start drilling out the petroleum that you turn into gasoline and diesel and all the other things that you get from petroleum products. Another source of natural gas comes from shale, which we do hydraulic fracturing or fracking, you might know it, where you get these big pockets of natural gas tied up in rock, and then you can drill down and pump a bunch of water in there, and it separates the rocks, and then whenever you get those little tiny gaps, all the natural gas can rush out and you can pipe it out. And that's actually why natural gas has become so cheap, especially as electricity fuel, is because we've developed this fracking technology that makes it so incredibly cheap to extract compared to previously, whenever it was mostly a byproduct of petroleum drilling. And then a third source that I think we'll probably talk about here in a couple minutes in more detail is renewable natural gas, where you can get it from landfills and from dairy farms, because natural gas is produced typically by what you call anaerobic fermentation, where microbes break down organic matter and then they produce methane. And it's a long, complicated process, but that's where we get all of our natural gas. That's all in the oil wells and such. It's just this is matter that was broken down millions of years ago. Same sort of processes that produce normal petroleum, which is one of them happens to produce methane.
Okay. Next question is, what makes natural gas a clean fuel?
I actually kind of touched on this a little bit a minute ago, but it really comes down to it being a short chain hydrocarbon. You only have the 1 carbon atom and 4 hydrogens, and there's a kind of funny little quirk of hydrocarbons that you get more energy every carbon you add, but that amount of energy doesn't necessarily scale with the number of carbons linearly. So 1 methane, or 1 mole of methane, if you burn it, it's actually cleaner, it produces less CO2 for the same energy content if you burned like diesel. So it's kind of like a fun little quirk there. And also methane doesn't really hold like sulfur. With less of those hydrogen kind of nodes in the hydrocarbon, for impurities to attach to, it stays a lot cleaner because it doesn't really attract sulfur. Sulfur is really a big one that we deal with because SOx emissions, it produces acid rain. But then also being a really low density gas, methane doesn't do super well at carrying a lot of the more impurities, or the impurities that we might care about in a vehicle fuel. A lot of that comes out in the cleaning process, and it's maybe easier to clean than some of the other fuels because of that.
Okay. How much of our country's energy needs are served by natural gas? You may not know that one, numbers and stuff. I didn't know if you had a...
Don't know the exact percentage on that, but if memory serves, it's somewhere in the 30 to 40% region. We get a significant amount of our energy now from natural gas, especially because coal's being phased out. And I know in Louisiana in particular, I think the number is somewhere in the 60 or 70% of our electricity in Louisiana comes from natural gas, with the lion's share of the rest coming from nuclear.
Okay, I don't know exactly when these numbers were run, but this says natural gas supplies 22% of the energy used in the United States.
Okay.
Is that Google saying that?
22%, yeah, that sounds
reasonable.
That sounds reasonable, yeah. And that number has been increasing really dramatically as a lot of coal plants are being taken offline because they're just really not economical anymore compared to natural gas.
Oh, this says 29% of our energy is used to heat about half the homes in the United States.
Yeah, so, and it also depends on what you define as energy usage as well. You know, some metrics are looking at just electricity generation, and that's very different from like overall energy used by the country, which might include transportation energy used, as well as like heating homes directly that doesn't come from electricity. So, you know, when you talk about energy like that, there's always different levels that you have to kind of look at. But yeah, 30 or so % is...
And for reference,
and
that number comes from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So
okay.
NAS.edu seems like a somewhat trustworthy source there.
And the EIA is another good resource for that sort of stuff. The Energy Information Association, I might be wrong about that, but they track these numbers pretty tightly as well, so you can get a lot of really good information there.
Okay, kind of a weird basic question here. Where in the United States is natural gas located? Or I guess how it, you probably talk about how it gets to different places and where it's made.
Yeah, so natural gas, and you can actually find maps of this kind of beautifully online, just have big pockets where the natural gas is located in the shale. The major producers of natural gas, and I don't want to leave anybody out, I believe Louisiana is the 4th largest producer in the country, 4th or 5th. But you get a lot here in Louisiana, a lot in Texas, a lot in Alaska, and then I think there's a Midwest state that I'm always surprised by produces a huge amount of it. And so you produce it a lot of those places, usually with fracking, and then you can just pipe it around everywhere. If you look at a map of pipelines in America, of natural gas pipelines, it's actually incredible. It looks like somebody, it looks like, you know, a toddler just kind of drew a bunch of straight lines everywhere, discovered a ruler, and thought that was just the coolest thing in the world, and decided to draw a bunch of straight lines on a piece of paper. That's kind of what the pipeline network looks like. And so you can pipe it around the country like that.
I've got the list.
Which of course, so what is the list of the producers then? Let's see how wrong I was.
It looks, no, you were right, Louisiana being 4th.
Okay.
Texas, Pennsylvania, and Oklahoma, it looks like.
Okay.
Also, I don't know about this, I don't know about that source though, so I may be completely wrong.
Yeah, I'm always surprised that there are a couple of them that I just wouldn't have thought about. But yeah, I know Texas and Louisiana are big ones. We also produce a lot of hydrogen because of that. Produce a lot of hydrogen through what's called steam reforming of methane. And the long and short of it is you put methane in and you get hydrogen and a bunch of CO2 out. And Louisiana is one of the largest hydrogen producers, as well as Texas, just because we have so much natural gas in our state. And I mentioned the anaerobic fermentation and just like no oxygen environments producing methane from bacteria and all sorts of stuff breaking organic matter down. It's not too surprising that Louisiana would have produced or would have a lot of trapped methane. You know, it's swampland, right? And whenever something dies, it goes under the water of the swamp, and there's no oxygen, no free oxygen, therefore, to become anaerobic fermentation or digestion. So a lot of that just starts producing methane and gets trapped under the bogs and such. So that's actually kind of just a fun thing there.
Okay, that was correct. It is Texas, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, Louisiana, then Ohio.
Okay.
And this is from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which is
Yes.
this EIA thing you must have just mentioned.
Yes.
And consumption, apparently, it's Texas, California, Louisiana, Florida,
Okay.
Pennsylvania.
That's probably why I said California erroneously, is the consumption.
They
Then.
consume a lot. They don't make it.
Yeah.
Okay. Why is natural gas used to run electric power plants? You kind of touched on using it for
Yeah.
energy earlier.
Yeah, so natural gas is used in electricity generation a lot these days for a few reasons. One, we have a very sophisticated pipeline network in America, so it's kind of easy, maybe easy is a strong word, but it's a lot easier to get natural gas to like a plant than maybe other fuels would be. Also, like we have a lot of experience with the type of engines that you can run with natural gas. It burns a lot like other fuels that we're used to, gasoline, propane, and all these sorts of things. We've done it for a very long time, so it's a mature technology in that regard. But the really big thing that natural gas is really good for electricity generation is what you call peak shaving. And so you hear a lot about natural gas peaker plants, and what that is coal doesn't like to. It's really difficult to increase power generation in a coal plant very quickly. So, say like the Super Bowl happens, and you go to halftime in the Super Bowl, and you can actually hear a lot about this, especially with like soccer in Europe. Anytime they go to halftime or the game's over, everybody goes into the kitchen real quick. They they put on a tea kettle or coffee, or they make a snack or whatever in the microwave, and electricity usage just skyrockets really, really, really quickly. And coal plants aren't very good. They're not nimble. They can't ramp up and ramp down really quickly when it comes to power generation. But natural gas can. It's much, much, much easier to really quickly turn on a natural gas generation plant. And so that's really one of the big things that they're the best for. And that's kind of one of the concerns that's pushing people towards thinking about electricity storage on the grid, especially with like battery technology or pumped hydro or any of those sorts of things, is those are even better than natural gas for peak shaving. And for it's really a term you call load following, where the electricity generation follows the electricity load really closely. And load following is one of like the most complicated things in electricity grid. So natural gas just happens to be really nimble and really versatile when it comes to that. And also, natural gas can satisfy what you call the base load as well. You can keep a natural gas plant on forever, and it just keeps running, which isn't really the case for like a lot of intermittent renewables like solar and wind, and I think hydro is even sometimes a little intermittent. So natural gas can just keep producing the base level, as well as doing the peak shaving and load following, and those are kind of two segments of electricity generation that being able to be satisfied by the same fuel is really, really valuable.
Why does natural gas smell like rotten eggs?
That's almost a trick question. So methane doesn't smell like anything. It's an odorless, clear gas. But natural gas, whenever you're using it in stuff, putting in it all depends on where you're talking about. But if you're putting it in a house or you're putting it in a vehicle fuel, they actually add a molecule called ethyl mercaptan to it, which is not surprisingly, it's a sulfur-based compound. And it's one of those really, really weird quirks of biology that we happen to be incredibly sensitive to ethyl mercaptan. We can actually smell, I look this number up all the time because I think it's just absolutely hilarious. We can smell 0.3 ppb, I believe it's ppb, of ethyl mercaptan. So 0.3 parts per billion concentrations of ethyl mercaptan, which is like absurdly low. And it helps that it's not particularly toxic at really any reasonable levels. It also burns, and it burns like fairly cleanly, especially because you don't have to put much of it in natural gas. So you can just kind of add it to it without changing any other part of the system. So they add ethyl mercaptan to the natural gas at different junctions. If you're doing it on like on-site fueling, then you'd add it before compression, typically. Or it's added whenever you get towards the distribution networks and the pipelines as well. So with pipelines, same thing with electricity. You've got your pipeline. You have transmission pipelines, which are higher pressure and much higher flow rates and much larger for long distances. and then they go to like a hub, and it'll splinter off into your distribution networks. And depending on where those distribution networks are going, they'll add ethyl mercaptan at that junction. So it's kind of added at different parts in the process.
Did you say
Why?
they would add it?
Why they would add it? So we can smell it, because methane's otherwise odorless. I guess I kind of danced around that one.
Toxic, right?
Methane's not toxic.
I mean, but like if you fill the room with it,
You can
that would be
asphyxiate.
bad.
Yeah.
Oh well, also it's explosive.
It also is explosive.
Yeah, that's the big one.
Yeah, it's mostly the flammability.
That's the one.
But yeah, it's added because we can't otherwise detect it. It's colorless and odorless, so you need something for that. And it's actually the same thing that we add to propane, and we add it for the exact same reason. And actually, fun fact for you with ethyl mercaptan is ethyl mercaptan is actually more volatile than natural gas. So if you're doing liquefied natural gas, where you compress and cool down natural gas so much that it becomes a liquid,
Thanks for answering.
which is
Right.
incredibly
Next
cold.
question.
You can't actually odorize that because the ethyl mercaptan doesn't dissolve into it. It evaporates away too quickly. So liquefied natural gas tends to be a much more pure fuel than normal natural gas and compressed natural gas, but also you can't odorize it. So there are lots of safety concerns that are kind of different between the two, just from that perspective.
Okay. Well, do you want to talk a little bit more about LNG and like
Yeah.
what the differences are between that and CNG?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned the basic principle is you cool it down and you compress it so much that it becomes a liquid. And as we all know, liquids are much more dense than gases are, so you can carry more of it in the same volume. And that's obviously kind of attractive for like maybe long haul trucking where you want to go to drive hundreds of miles on the same tank. It's harder to do that with compressed natural gas because you need much bigger tanks to get the same quantity of fuel. I think it was expected for a while that liquefied natural gas would really take over the trucking industry, and it kind of hasn't, at least at the moment. And I think that there are various reasons for that, and I kind of came into the clean cities world after that kind of paradigm question of what was going to happen. But I think my understanding is that it's just really difficult to liquefy natural gas. I mean, it takes a lot of energy. Compression has always been one of the biggest problems with compressed natural gas. Is you compress it to 3,600 psi, so you have to have really heavy compressors and really high pressure tanks. And liquefied natural gas is even more so. If you go to like a liquefaction site, it's absolutely massive. There's a bunch of complicated, valves and junctions and all sorts of really cool stuff. They're really neat to go to if you get a chance to. So it's not quite taking off in the long haul trucking world like we expected it to, but it's actually finding a lot of traction, and it's kind of coming into vogue for shipping, like sea shipping, oceanic travel and all that sort of stuff, marine, for a few reasons. But the biggest one is that it's much cleaner than what they're usually using, which marine vessels have this really big problem of you can't use the heavy crude that they usually use at sea near shore. So once you get towards the coast, you actually have to switch from the fuel that they're using, which is incredibly dirty, disgusting stuff that nobody wants. It's the waste product of all the rest of petroleum refining. And they're using that out at sea, and then they get up to shore and they have to change fuels over, which is incredibly difficult to do, both like tuning the engines, just a simple thing. They've got different combustion characteristics, but also all of your seals and your piston rings and your seals and everything, like they have different lubricating needs between the two fuels, and it's actually a gigantic problem that a lot of research is being done about. But you don't have to do that with liquefied natural gas. You can use it both at sea and near the shore. And it's got a lot of favorable characteristics when it comes to combustion because it has a nice combustion ratio or octane number. And it's fairly dense whenever you make it liquefied natural gas. So that's kind of coming into vogue now. Especially there was a recent decision, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's like a collaborative of the different shipping companies, and they kind of put out rules for themselves, and they're all voluntary, I believe. And they recently were like, hey, we need lower emission shipping, and we need to have a new standard at this threshold. And it looks like to satisfy that, a lot of shipping companies are going to have to start using liquefied natural gas. So it's kind of coming into vogue there. But But that's kind of the long and short of it for at least over-road, is it's not quite coming into vogue like I think we expected it to. But it definitely still has some applications.
Okay. Would you like to talk a little bit about renewable natural gas and what that is and how it compares?
Yeah, so renewable natural gas is a lot of fun, in my opinion. And it's chemically identical. It's exactly the same thing. It's methane. And there are lots of ways that you can produce it. So I mentioned earlier on that methane comes from what you call anaerobic fermentation, which is just fermentation, microbes are breaking organic matter down, and then anaerobic meaning without oxygen being present. And there are lots of situations that are naturally going to undergo anaerobic fermentation. As actually, I mentioned this earlier with swamps. Organic matter dies in a swamp, falls down to the bottom of the water, and it's just going to decay. And so there's no oxygen there. So it's going to start producing methane over time if it's got the right kind of biological mix down there. And so if you actually go to the swamp and you see like little bubble pockets just kind of happen randomly, that's actually probably methane. Just a little fun fact there. Also, the little Lord of the Rings scene in the when they're going through the dead marsh and all the bubbles, and some of them are on fire. That's kind of a bit of a harken back to like there actually are swamps where you can see fire on the top of the water from methane production. But in a more usable sense, landfills are kind of obvious candidates for methane production. So when it comes to anthropogenic methane sources, anthropogenic just coming from humans, things that we cause to happen, landfills are actually gigantic. They produce a huge amount of methane. And it's not too surprising. You have a bunch of food waste and a bunch of organic matter that we're throwing away and goes and sits in the landfills, and then you cover up the landfill. And so it's like, here's a bunch of organic matter, here's a big cover on it, it's going to start producing methane. And there are already EPA requirements that once a landfill gets to a certain size, you have to start flaring that methane off. Because methane is actually about 25 times worse than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So you really want to get rid of that methane somehow or another. And burning it turns it into CO2, right? But the neat thing is that what if you burn it in your engine first? So you're still making it into CO2, so you're still reducing the global warming potential of the product, but you're also getting useful work out of it by burning it in your engine. And landfills aren't the only source. You can do it from wastewater treatment plants. One of the main processes in wastewater treatment is putting all the sludge in a big vat and covering it up and doing anaerobic fermentation. Because a lot of the process of breaking that matter down actually puts it into something that's a bit less nasty and more desirable in wastewater. And so that's part of the process there. So you can tap off that gas and use it. And then one of the really big ones that you hear a lot about, especially in California, and I think Oregon has one of these as well, the dairy farms, is you can produce methane at a dairy farm. And the idea is that once all the cattle do their thing, you wash all of their nastiness into a pond, all of their waste into a pond, and you cover up that pond and you just kind of let it sit and let it percolate, and eventually you get natural gas out of that. Say a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but we often talk about, you hear it all the time, of like, why do we care about how much methane we're producing when cows produce so much methane? Which is a silly argument, because somebody else is doing a bad job doesn't mean that you should also do a bad job. But B, we could actually do something about that methane and capture a good bit of it. And that's becoming really, really attractive, especially because dairy farms aren't required to flare. Landfills are required to flare, so you're going to do something with that methane at some point for landfills. But for dairy farms, you're not going to. So if you can actually kind of reclaim that's hugely beneficial. And by the way, just a little bit of jargon that gets thrown around that might be useful to mention is methane coming from cows, from their digestive tract, is called enteric methane. So enteric just having to do with the bowels. So that's kind of a thing thrown out there as well. And there's one little thing that's worth mentioning there is whenever you take the natural gas out, you have to clean it up. A lot of that natural gas the renewable natural gas has some pretty nasty things in it. Sometimes they have nasty sulfur compounds, or if you're doing from wastewater treatment or landfills, you have silicon compounds, which are not super nasty, but they're bad for certain systems. And so a lot of that's cleaned and usually call that process conditioning.
Okay.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, it was just to follow up on your dairy thing. What do the farmers do with the gas once they reclaim it?
Yeah, so it depends, of course. There's most of it these days tends to be used for electricity generation, um, and so maybe they'll put down a pipeline to a local power plant and use it to produce electricity there, um, which has some benefits, like you don't have to clean certain compounds out. Maybe is maybe a thing, or you can operate at a lower BTU range. For like a vehicle, you want to get it up to 95% methane, but maybe for electricity generation, you can deal with some of that CO2 and just operate there. I'm not sure if that's actually done or not, but I know that sort of thing is possible. You can do less cleaning, but then you can also use it as a vehicle fuel if you clean it up to spec and you have someone there to actually buy it from you. But I think a lot of it's just done for pipeline injection or electricity generation. Yeah, and then the pipeline injection too. The way that it's just like selling renewable electricity on an electric grid, is that you don't really buy, like, it's almost nonsensical to say like buying the electrons from the solar panel. What you really do is you're committing to paying for this many kilowatt hours of electricity. Same thing with methane, this many BTU, or this many SCFMs SCFs at this BTU of natural gas, and I'm paying the person who produced the renewable natural gas. And so it's kind of like, it's a big credit system, just saying I'm allocating this much to you and putting this much in the pipeline, and I'm going to pool this much from the source and pay that guy. So so a lot of it's pipeline injection.
Why don't more landfills produce RNG? Why isn't it more common?
It's capital expense is the big thing. So we actually do have a decent number of projects in the country. I don't remember the number for landfill alone. I want to say total RNG projects in the country are total somewhere around 600, and landfills are somewhere around 150 to 200. I might be a little off on those numbers, but the capital expense is pretty high. So I work with the St. Landry Parish landfill out in Washington, Louisiana, fairly regularly, and they're a very small landfill. They're about 10 years from actually being large enough where they're required by the EPA to flare. So they're fairly small, and it costs them something like $4 million to actually do build the entire site there. So the capital expense is pretty high. It's also a very young field. The renewable natural gas, just in general, is fairly young. So there's not as much information out. A lot of landfills maybe don't know that you can do that, or don't know about the profitability of it. And then it's just like the technology hasn't fully matured yet. So like St. Landry Parish was one of the first landfills, especially of its size, to in the whole country, to do what they're doing and make vehicle fuel from landfill gas. And that was in 2011 is whenever their site came online. So it's only 8 years ago. So it's a fairly new field, but that's actually one of the things that we're working on a lot is Louisiana Clean Fuels in particular. It's working with landfills to try to figure out how they can get involved with this.
Yeah, you're working on a curriculum, right?
We are, and we're not going to talk too much about that. But yeah, we're working on a curriculum to teach landfills about how to do this, and what sort of considerations they need to think about. One of the things that's kind of coming up in our world a lot right now is that there are different credits for using renewable natural gas. So you have like the low carbon fuel standard, and you've got a bunch of credits in California, and you've got the RINs, renewables identification numbers, and there are different credits based on what type of fuel you're producing, where the feedstock comes from, and then where you're actually selling it. If you're using it in a vehicle versus using it for electricity generation or pipeline injection, there are different amounts that you can get per like GGE or per volume of your gas. And right now, I can't speak too much to this because I still don't fully understand it, but the value of RINs as a vehicle fuel is going down slowly, because there aren't, for like the other standards, the pipeline injection standards, there's a natural ratcheting system in them where this much has to be injected every year, and that number is increasing because they're mandating that this much renewables comes online. And so because there's more demand, the value can kind of come up like that. But that's not true of RINs. So as a vehicle fuel, it's actually becoming less attractive to, economically attractive to make RNG and put it in a vehicle. a lot of time it makes more sense economically to put it into a pipeline just because of those credit systems. The RINs just happen to be losing value over time when the other ones aren't.
It says, when do you expect the curriculum to be available?
That is a fantastic question. Next question? No.
I mean, it's new, right?
Sorry?
It's pretty new.
It's very new. So the curriculum is kind of coming on the heels of an operations manual that I've been helping St. Landry Parish Solid Waste write, because they were like a one-man operation for a very long time. And we wanted to kind of take that one guy and like basically download his brain and put it on paper so that God forbid something happens, or maybe he just hires somebody and wants them to have a reference. So we've been helping them write that, and that just kind of wrapped up recently. So the curriculum is the next step, and there's a lot of, I'm very familiar with that site, and I haven't been to other sites as much. So it's going to take a little bit of like, I guess the word's like genericizing, like I need to learn more about the other sites before I can really put anything on paper for a curriculum. But that's in the works, and yeah, I don't know, a year, 2 years, 20 years. It'll be a bit, but there are lots of projects right now with putting together information about RNG that I'm not sure what I can talk about and what I can't talk about. But there are going to be more resources coming online fairly soon regarding that. Who asked that question?
Empire Clean Cities.
Empire Clean Cities? Ah, gotcha. Okay. Fun.
Okay. Probably kind of wrap up some of these questions unless they have more questions to add.
Yeah.
But
What coffee is getting
what
cold?
are natural gas vehicles? Or like, what is the difference? I guess between the different.
Yeah, that should have been asked a while ago, I guess, actually. I should have mentioned it a while ago. So natural gas vehicles. So I mentioned that that it's a very mature technology, the engines you get from natural gas, because it's kind of similar to gasoline and propane. And it's the exact same engine that you can use for gasoline almost across the board. It's spark ignited. It's got similar compression ratios. You produce the energy the exact same way. You pump your fuel in, and then you compress and ignite. The couple differences is it is a higher octane fuel, so you can actually get higher compression ratios out of it. It does burn hotter than gasoline, which can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing if your engine's not tuned for that. But the main difference is the fueling system, where I mentioned that the tanks are under 3,600 psi, which is very, very high. And then the whole fueling system is going to be at a much higher pressure than like a gasoline fueling system. So there are a few valves or a few regulators that drop it down to a lower psi for the actual fuel injection. But it's so similar to gasoline in a lot of ways that you can actually do biofuel vehicles where the engine operates both on gasoline and natural gas depending on which one you're giving it. So you can have a CNG tank, compressed natural gas tank, or you can have a gasoline tank, and you can have a gasoline tank, and you can just switch between the two of them on the go. They just operate very, very similarly. So for those systems, you'll have the computer for the vehicle's computer, the ECM, will actually have that kind of programmed in, that it'll switch fuel ratios and such on the fly whenever you flip that switch between the two of them. And it might change some valve timing or something like that. But yeah, you can just do that on the go with the same engine. It's that similar. But then you can also do dedicated natural gas engines and tune it much more specifically for natural gas and take better advantage of that high octane number. Make reinforced pistons. I know that there have been some issues with the older models of these vehicles where the pistons might like melt because it's much higher temperature combustion than what they're used to for gasoline. So you can actually do a lot of things to make your engine way more efficient working under natural gas versus gasoline by making it a dedicated engine. And then also recently there have been developments with ultra low NOx certified, which is a CARB standard, California Air Resource Board. CARB certified ultra low NOx CNG engines where they're just tuned so well, and I guess they've got filtration or EGR or something. I don't actually know how they did it, but they get the NOx numbers way low, down to I think it's 0.02 grams per mile, which is very, very low. And I think I mentioned this in the last live stream, it's worth repeating. NOx emissions come from high temperature combustion. The lower the temperature of the combustion, the less NOx you form. And that's kind of fairly logical because nitrogen is a really strong bond. So you have to be really high temperature to break that nitrogen apart and make NOx. So the fact that they took a hotter burning fuel, CNG, it's hotter than gasoline, or burns hotter than gasoline, and they made it such low NOx is actually really quite impressive. So that's going to come along as well. I think that there are probably more than one engine manufacturer who's managed it now. I don't know for sure, but the only one I'm familiar with is Cummins. Cummins released their ultra low NOx.
You mean LCF member Cummins?
LCF member Cummins.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, they're the only one that I'm aware of who've done it. I wouldn't be too surprised if somebody else has maybe managed it at this point. And it was fun, like the new Roush engines actually have managed to get ultra low NOx certified as well. It's a propane.
LCF member Roush.
LCF member Roush. So yeah, there have been a lot of strides recently on that, which is great because now you're making dedicated CNG engines where before a lot of them were aftermarket conversions. And so it's amazing. Whenever you make a dedicated piece of machinery, you can get really cool results out of it that are better than before whenever you're doing aftermarket conversions.
Okay. Where would you normally see like a natural gas engine? Like most people's vehicles use gasoline. Personal vehicles do. So where do you see natural gas used?
Yeah. So you typically see natural gas engines in fleets that go to the same spot every day. So if they've got like a fueling depot or something like that, where all the vehicles go to a single central location, those are much more attractive for CNG because the compression is so expensive. So having one fueling station service all of them works really well. And then it logically follows that the fleets doing that are often refuse companies like waste haulers, and Republic Services, Waste Management, Waste Connections, all of them. They use a lot of natural gas in their fleet. And you can see it on the backs of their vehicles or on the tops of their vehicles. So if you look for like the refuse haulers, if you look at the very top of the trash bit, I don't know what words you're supposed to use there. You'll see a little rectangular bit with a bunch of little ports in it, and that's going to be the CNG tanks, and one port for each of the tanks for inspections. You can also see it on the backs of them, on the very, very back. They'll have like a curved rectangular bit with, again, ports, or just directly behind the cab, often like a little L shape. You'll see that with, again, the little telltale ports that are the CNG tanks. You'll also notice a lack of a big diesel tank in the DEF, diesel exhaust fluid, tanks as well. Those are suspiciously missing. And a lot of them are branded as such, because it's great PR.
What examples of like LCF member fleets use natural gas?
Yes, Republic Services is our waste hauler that uses it. And then also UPS is a really big one. UPS has a lot of natural gas vehicles in their fleet, also propane vehicles. And they typically just emblazon it on the side of their box trucks that'll just say natural gas vehicle, or fueled by American natural gas or something to that effect in big yellow letters. But then you can also see the same thing of having those ports, or you'll see the big CNG tank that are kind of a side saddle tanks under the bed if it's like the freight haulers, or like the 18-wheelers. You'll see a lot of those as well. And then, yeah, that telltale rectangular box with the little ports is really what you should be looking for if you want to find them around. Sportran uses them, so it's the Shreveport's transit agency. A lot of transit companies are going for it for their buses. And so they operate 100% CNG and electricity up in Shreveport, Louisiana. And those are becoming super duper popular in California because there are lots of mandates about what the transit companies can use in their buses. And so a huge number of the buses in like LA and stuff just run on pure natural gas as well. So transit agencies are a popular one as well. And then we've got some fun off the wall ones like Green Seasons or Corporate Green. Here in Baton Rouge is a landscaping company, and they run a lot of natural gas as well. They run some of it in their lawnmowers as well as their vehicles. Ivan Smith Furniture is another like local distribution company. They operate a lot of it. So there are lots of them around, and I missed quite a few of them, but we don't want to list everybody.
All right, I think that covers our questions here.
Okay. Does anybody else have were there any questions on the Instagram?
Yeah. Any final words about natural gas?
I guess it's worth mentioning too. I talked about how the compression is really expensive because you have to go to 3,600 psi. It is worth mentioning that you can actually do lower powered fueling stations to do what you call slow fill or time fill, where basically you connect the hose to the vehicle overnight, and as opposed to filling it up super quickly, that's comparable to like pumping diesel or something like that. It'll just slowly fuel the vehicles overnight, and by the time your drivers get to work the next morning, you've got a full tank. So that's a popular one too. It's much cheaper to install those fueling stations for a fleet than it is to install the high compression fast fill stations.
Is that what Sportrain uses?
That's popular as well. No, they don't have any slow fill. They've got that fast fill in the back of their site.
You mentioned overnight things. Never mind.
I know we talked about in one of the other fleets is that they don't have space for the slow fill. Because it does take up a good bit of space. You need to have a different parking spot for each of the vehicles, and then hoses that come down. Usually it's under an awning that'll have all the kind of hoses being routed up, and then you've got the compressor that kind of just pumps gas into the vehicles overnight. And there are even some technologies coming online as well. There are some innovations being done right now. So there's it's called adsorbed natural gas, where the high pressure tanks, the 3,600 psi tank is quite high pressure. And very expensive to do, but you can do this adsorbed natural gas where they're putting like a carbon media in there that the methane molecules stick to. It's a very porous media, and so they stick to it. And that sticking energy actually reduces the amount of compression you have to do, because it kind of adds like a suction force or like a magnetism type deal. And that allows them to have much lower pressure tanks and still get decent gas volumes out of it. And that also means that you don't have to compress it at high, or have such a large compressor to actually fuel those vehicles. And they're almost like, you can actually do it at home. They make systems, so I never remember the name of the company. I think it's Energy, who does the adsorbed natural gas. There are a few, or Ingevity. There are a few of them that are working on it. But some of them even have little compressors you can connect to your natural gas pipeline at home, just your normal utility pipeline. And you can actually fuel your vehicle overnight if you've got one of these. And it's a little bit like a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, where you only hold 4 or 5 gallons of natural gas. So that gives you like...
Sorry about that.
That'll give you like 120 mile range, something like that. But you get to fuel it overnight at home, and then it switches to gasoline afterwards. So kind of neat little systems. Like there are some innovations kind of going on there that reduce that compression number. So I think that's mostly what I have to say.
All right.
So I don't know what fuel we're gonna do next.
We're going to do electric vehicles next month for National Drive Electric Week.
That makes sense. We're gonna talk about electric vehicles next month. So there'll be another live stream, and we'll go over some of the basics there, and that'll be a fun discussion as well. So
I'm hoping to maybe do it on site at one of our events or something.
That'll be fun.
Or do maybe smaller ones. So maybe make a kind of an event out of it.
Oh, that'll be fun. Yeah. So we'll do that live stream, and I hope y'all tune in. Hope that this was entertaining or educational or whatever.
And we'll be uploading these videos to our YouTube channel, LCF TV. You can find links to it on our website. And so if you need to go back and review any of these questions, you'll be able to find that there. That'll be a resource.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you all for tuning in.